Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA, a national network of educators dedicated to making human rights education a central focus of preschool through higher education in the United States. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA. This podcast aims to raise the level of awareness about human rights education and help listeners engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a central focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education. Welcome to Human Rights Education Now. Our guest for this episode is David Shiman, a longtime friend and colleague in the field of human rights education. David is Professor Emeritus at the University of Vermont, and I first met David over 35 years ago in Chicago at a meeting of the Amnesty International Education Task Force. It's actually called the Steering Committee. How are you doing today, David?
I'm doing really well, thank you. I'm healthy. It's warm inside. Happily, I'm not outside in the cold. We've had some bitter cold days, but it's not too bad. Today, it's a balmy 30 degrees.
Yeah, it's about a little over 40 here in New Jersey, but last weekend it was pretty frigid, actually. It was down about 5 degrees. So how did you first become interested in human rights issues, not necessarily education, but human rights itself?
It was an interesting question because I really wasn't, I sort of flowed into human rights. I sort of grew up in civil rights and other statements about this isn't fair, this doesn't seem right. And I had no organizing theme to help me make sense of it. And so for me, for a long time, in my really early days, it was growing up with Jackie Robinson and watching him come and play for the Dodgers and all the challenges that he had to deal with. I think that was a launch pad in many ways for me. And then this Vietnam War, a whole range of things during the rest of my life that living in Africa for a period of time, all sort of helped me frame questions about why are certain people treated and receive more rights and justice than others, and that's not right. And what do you do about it? And that sort of grew into human rights. I don't think I knew about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights until I was out of college. Nobody taught it. There was the sort of partially there was a anti-United Nations anxiety about communism period, and human rights had this flavor of globalization that we might get subsumed under some world government that would be destructive, and people shied away from that. Certainly no teacher I ever had, I don't think ever used the words human rights. But the UDHR became, I guess, an organizing theme for me and a reference point. And I think that led to curriculum writing and things that dealt with first with prejudice and discrimination, and then with issues specifically related to human rights.
So how did you get connected to Amnesty International?
I decided to run for the board, and I think it was either a self-nomination or I had a petition. I don't quite remember, but I remember walking. I was elected, and elected on the grounds of I wanted to promote human rights education, and Amnesty wasn't doing very much. I remember I walked into the first board meeting and introduced myself, and somebody said, "Oh, you, nobody's ever heard of you." And I chuckled to myself, and I said, well, maybe that'll change. And then, as you know, we developed a cadre of about 8 or 10 people who became the steering committee. Nancy Flowers, yourself, Ellen Moore, Janet Schmidt, a variety of people, and then it just grew, and who published in the fourth R, the rights publication on curriculum activities related to human rights, and I think sort of brought Amnesty, which was willing to be brought at that time. I think he saw them into the field of human rights education. So that was very exciting, and I think it's interesting that cadre of folks was also major organizers for Human Rights Educators USA. I mean, most of us were still around, and I think we're feeling frustrated that human rights had sort of fallen off the educational plate, and wanted to reconnect it to the work that a lot of people, and a lot more people, were doing around the country. So Amnesty was crucial in launching and also getting me involved doing workshops in Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a variety of other places. And so connecting me to a sort of global network of one sort or another.
Now, those workshops occurred at the fall of communism. Is that correct?
Right. I used to have one in Poland. The class was filled with solidarity workers, and most of whom didn't think of themselves as human rights activists, and wanted to learn about human rights. And I said, you've been living this stuff and doing it. But they were teachers now, and they wanted to translate that into their classrooms.
Did you get the sense when you were doing that there was a common sort of framework for advancing the field of human rights education, or it was sort of being developed on the fly?
I think it was being developed on the fly for the most part. There were groups. There was a group in England that was systematically trying to advance things. There was a group I knew in the Netherlands, which was active. There were pockets in the United States, but there was the United Nations. But the United Nations at that time wasn't asserting itself and asserting a role as a leader in human rights education. And there were groups in the Philippines, in South Africa. So there were pockets around the world. And I think one of the challenges was we didn't have any way of connecting with each other. And the social media and the internet was a major influence, I think, in helping us find each other, share materials with each other, run workshops with each other, as we could later on nowadays with Zoom and things of that sort. So I think, but I think in those early years, there was not a lot of organizing around central themes that we would all try to promote globally in some form or another.
I remember Laurie Weisberg had a thing called the Internet on Human Rights, but it wasn't electronic. It was a publication.
Yeah.
And it was like a bibliography. There had articles and things like that. But you're right. I think going electronic on the internet allowed people to communicate so much more effectively, actually quickly, right, and connect with one another. But even so, I'd like you to talk a bit about what you perceive or what you know about the challenges for human rights education in the United States, because I think one of the things that always has been for lack of a better term, an obstacle has been the idea of American exceptionalism. And I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah. When I spent the morning talking with an undergraduate student at college in the area about American exceptionalism. An example, in a small village in Vermont, there was a teacher who wanted to teach about human rights, and the principal was worried because he didn't know anything about it, and the school board was worried because it smelled fishy. And so we wrote a letter to Senator Leahy and said, would you please write to this school and tell them that the human rights are okay, and so that this teacher can get some support, which he did, but they still decided not to let her do it. There were fears that that we would fall under, and some people under some sort of world government, fears that we were superior, and this might pull us down, make us more mediocre. I think there was a sort of the sense that human rights was something that happened elsewhere. And we didn't have to deal with that here. There were human rights violations in Israel and Palestine, there were South Africa, China, everywhere in the world. But it wasn't something we had to deal with here. We had civil rights, but we didn't have human rights, because human rights meant connecting us in some way to the United Nations. And for some people, that was really problematic. If I could just make a little aside, I worked in Costa Rica, and there was a sense in Costa Rican teachers and people I worked with that they didn't have to do very much about human rights education, because Costa Rican, the whole country was human rights. We were there when I first arrived. The first place I was taken was a tourist trip, was to see a piece of the Berlin Wall that had been given to them by the Germans to honor their work in human rights. And so there was this ethos a lot of people talked about, that we are a human rights nation and superior and exceptional with respect to the other countries. And I think we have a lot of that in our country as well.
Even though, for example, Martin Luther King transformed from being a civil rights advocate to a human rights advocate in his last few campaigns.
Yes. Yeah, and got a lot of static from that, from people who felt it was undercutting civil rights movement by expanding it to the anti-Vietnam War and a whole range of other things. But I think he saw connections, as I saw connections, that this Universal Declaration of Human Rights were a lot of interrelated articles. They weren't freestanding articles. You couldn't do Article 15 without looking at injustice and saying, you realize that the poverty is connected to population issues, and population issues are connected to environmental issues, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have to make a bigger picture. And I think American exceptionalism was resistant to that in a lot of ways.
I'm interested in knowing what you think has been done in higher education, because you worked for many, many years as a professor. And in my own experience in higher education, like you, I never had any coursework in human rights when I was an undergraduate, even through all my work until I got to the doctoral level and I started to work on it myself. Yeah. So I'm wondering what your perception is of sort of the landscape of human rights education in post-secondary schools.
All right, well, let me talk about my institution first, because I know that best. At the University of Vermont, trying to promote human rights education was very frustrating. My colleagues would talk about social justice, they talk about prejudice, discrimination, but when you tried to help people frame it in terms of human rights and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was something that they never seemed to have time to fit into the curriculum, and weren't too concerned because they were talking about prejudice and discrimination. And I appreciate that. I'd rather have them talk about those sorts of things and equity and than not talk about them. So I think there was a frustration that I felt. I tried to introduce into my colleagues an activity I developed called with Christy Resilius Palmer, taking the human rights temperature of your school. And I had some interest by school teachers who wanted to use it in their schools, but I couldn't get any interest at the university for that. And that was frustrating. And I think once you get into higher education, it's very hard in many cases to continue your development, because you're so pressured to do what you have to do for immediately, that to branch off into a new field, and human rights education was new for a lot of people, was not something people had time for or could tie in directly to their work. Nationally, I don't know whether the same conditions existed in other institutions, but it certainly has been very slow. I think we've, what's her name? Sarita Kargas, is that her name? Did a survey of higher education institutions, and where she found a substantial number of courses dealing with human rights education, but very few programs. The isolated course here and there, human rights and the economy, human rights and whatever it might be. And many of the courses were related to law in the law schools. So I think there's a frustration not a frustration, a resistance or a hesitancy to add something new to a curriculum that you think you have pretty well packaged after a few years out of graduate school. And I appreciate that. It's a challenge, but I think in teacher training, it's real. Most of the teachers we worked with in schools had learned nothing about human rights in their teacher preparation. And so it was not starting from scratch because they had a lot of other competencies, but we really needed to do a lot of backfilling that we had hoped that's after a certain number of years you don't have to do. So that was a real frustration, I think.
Well, you make an interesting point that the academy, for lack of a better term, has a whole different reward system than, for example, K-12 education. And that reward system, it seems to me, mitigates against, like you said, taking risks.
Yes, and they weren't going to write, they weren't going to publish about it. They would have to weave it into the curriculum, and they'd almost always say, "I got my syllabus done." Just, I'll try to think about it for next semester, and that was, and I ended up with a colleague creating shortly after we arrived at the University of Vermont, the Center for World Education, which was a curriculum resource center teaching about global issues. And as I got more and more involved in it, the global issues seemed to always come back to human rights in some form or other. And we would run workshops for teachers, courses for teachers. It was on multicultural education or on environmental education. It ultimately comes back to questions around justice and rights. And so we were able to weave it in that way, but that was all outside of the basic curriculum. That was teacher development. It wasn't teacher preparation.
Did you engage any of your human rights work when you were a union advocate too?
Well, that's funny. I mean, I was president of the union for 10 years and chief negotiator for 4 different contracts. And I always chuckled to myself, I got to tell you, when we talked about our human rights, and we were probably the most privileged worker class that you could find around, and so I was always a little hesitant to use the term the human rights of professors because it felt, I mean, we were a privileged group, and yet we certainly had the right to organize. We had the right to advocate for all these, healthcare and these things that are human rights and grounded in the Universal Declaration. But we were not an oppressed class. It was a little resistant when colleagues would say, "Professors' rights are human rights." All right, but when I look around the world, all around us, around the campus, there are a lot of people who would have enjoyed to have our oppression, and would have benefited from it. So, but
what's interesting about that, though, is that, and as you know, you witnessed it yourself, that higher education has become much more of reliant on part-time instructors now. It seems to me that there's sort of an opportunity there to engage the issues of human rights, particularly with adjuncts and these other, as you know, recently the big strike at the University of California and so forth. What would you say about that?
Oh, I think that's happening in the including graduate students who are graduate teaching fellows, and getting them organized, and because they are groups that have been historically quite exploited at the benefit of the larger college system. And I think that's important that they become organized, be able to advocate, particularly, I mean, to come and teach a course at the University of Vermont in the beginning years when they were doing it, when I was teaching one course, was maybe $2,500, $3,000. And so you try to piece together 3 courses, because 4 courses would make you full time. But your 3 courses, you'd probably end up with, in some cases, 120 students. And here I am, a tenure track professor, doing seminars of 8 and 10 students with job security and lots of other benefits that they don't have. So the organizing for those folks, I think, was really important. And I saw that happening all around here, at least, and elsewhere as well. But the West Coast has been a leader in a lot of this, and sort of Rutgers too has been very active. The Rutgers unions that we have looked to and see some of the things that they were doing.
Yeah, well, things are not going too well in contract negotiation at Rutgers right now, but that's a discussion for another time. So you actually were one of the first scholars to prepare a book specifically about international human rights. Can you tell us how that idea developed and some of the challenges along the way?
I'm not sure how it developed. Always, it was enabled because of one of the benefits of higher education. I had a sabbatical, and I had an opportunity to go someplace with financial support and write and do research. And with the evolution that had taken place for me as I'd moved, and I'd wrote a book on prejudice called The Prejudice Book that was published by the Anti-Defamation League. And I liked that style of writing, of curriculum activities, and my growing interest in human rights and human rights education connected to the fact that we have dissident cousins in the Soviet Union, who in the 70s I went to visit as a representative of my family and spent a week with the sort of underground group in Moscow working against psychiatric abuse in mental institutions. And it all sort of swelled up, and I saw the absence of anything on human rights education except a very nice book by, what's his name, Ralph Petman from Australia. I think it was called maybe the ABCs of Human Rights or something like that. I can't recall exactly. And I had this opportunity to go to the University of Denver, which had a Center for Teaching International Relations, CTIR. And they were interested in having a book in there. They had a variety of books, and they wanted one on human rights. So this was an opportunity, and we went out there, and I worked with them. That was the place where I could work, and we and wrote this book. The original title of the book was Teaching Human Rights. The title we ended up with was Teaching About Human Rights. Teaching human rights sounded too much of like advocacy. And at a time out there, particularly, this was a time where nationally, Phyllis Schlafly was promoting anti-globalism. A guy named Tommy Tancredo in the Southwest was also really going after global educators. And they pulled back from this title to one that was safer so that you could teach about, but you wouldn't have to advocate for. And well, in fact, we went to a meeting out there where we had 300 teachers, 300 parents from a small community come to an introduction from the Center for Teaching International Relations about a book that they wanted to have the school use. And they attacked these people every direction you can conceivably think of, pulling out sentences out of the book and distorting them and misrepresented something that, of course, nobody does anymore. And we went away, and the whole project just died, killed. But it was Tommy Tancredo, it was the Phyllis Schlafly, it was the whole climate of that. This was a group of left-leaning educators who were out to undermine and destroy our schools and tie us into a global network that would destroy America and America's exceptionalism, as we talked about it before. So. And the next two editions of that book were later became Teaching Human Rights. We pulled out of the about. And so trying to bring together the advocacy and education to me, are two dimensions of the same spirit, if you want to call it that.
So the attacks were during the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah. I was out there in 85.
Right. So it was during the period of the second Reagan administration. And then that was about 2 years before you and I first met when we had that meeting in Chicago.
Yeah.
So even though there was this resistance, it didn't seem to stop the forward momentum.
Well, I sort of decided I was just going to do it. and CTAR was supportive. They just wanted a little lower profile than they had originally wanted. I mean, we would get hate mail all the time from organizations and fundamentalist Christian groups of one sort or another. And I wasn't on I guess I was on sort of a mission for myself to produce this book that I saw as could make a contribution. And it was, but it was also, the book was important for me in it helped me organize my own thinking and my own feelings about this. I mean, there are disparate chapters, but they all came back to the Universal Declaration for me, and to sort of a conception of justice that involved, people engaged in work to helping other people. Because I think that for me is a part of what I built into the book, sections of it, that there was an action dimension to it. Otherwise, it's just teaching about.
If I can paraphrase, the idea is that you inserted or made central to it the idea of social responsibility of the educator.
Yes, not in the very beginning. I was a little timid as well, but I think that became much more important to me. And as I connected more, I mean, in 1985 is when I also joined Amnesty International in the board. And so that there was the impetus for responsibility and action that was in the climate, and Amnesty supported that as well. I mean, that's what it's all about in so many ways. So yes, I'd say that was very important for me, because I think I remember giving a talk somewhere and complaining about educators who might do a unit on hunger, and then after 2 or 3 weeks say, okay, now let's do a unit on war, and then do a unit on so-and-so, and they would hop from one unit to another, and at no point did they say, so what? So what does it mean for how you lead your life? What does it mean for what's going on in our community? That was risky in many places. And it was also something a lot of people weren't educated to think about.
Well, what's interesting is that you're really talking about a Deweyan conception of education.
I hadn't thought of it quite that way. Yeah.
I mean, Dewey argued that there needed to be relationship between the school and the community, and that this was a central part of what he argued was American democracy, correct?
Yeah, but so the problem person would be reading Dewey with his class at the university and finishing the book or books or article and then going on to the next book. I mean, that's this, and Dewey's was about school community and democracy, and I think that so there, I think it's a Deweyite undergirding principle for Amnesty International and for much of the work in human rights education.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that in all the work I did in my own doctoral study and all that, and all the work in education, until we started to actually, and I mean we as a collective, started to work on this field itself, there really was no conception or no discussion of connecting educational theory or foundations to the idea of human rights education.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program continues our conversation with David Shiman, a longtime leader in human rights education. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and host Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, editor Elizabeth Schwab, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now graphic was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.